Okay, I want to talk to you about the Israeli-Palestinian peace deal, which seems like it's always being talked about. I'm only 40 years old, and it's like it's been my whole lifetime. Every president, every political situation is Israeli-Palestinian peace deal. Before I do that, go ask you that though, I was going to ask Pastor Steve this question, and that is, what is the Jewish people's connection to the land of Israel? Because I think biblically, if we start there, it'll kind of make sense for maybe what Israel, the policies that they take. So how would you answer that question?
Avi was just talking about the Abraham Accords, and that's obviously named after Abraham out of the Old Testament. And Abraham came from Ur of the Chaldees and came down to the land of Canaan, and God made him a promise multiple times that he was going to give him and his descendants the land. Land, nation, and a blessing is what God had said to him. And God in Genesis chapter 15 said that he wasn't going to get it during his lifetime, but that the Israelis were going to go down to Egypt, and they were going to serve in Egypt for 400 years, and then that God was going to deliver them. And that's exactly what happened. And so that wraps up the book of Genesis. Abraham has Isaac, Isaac has Jacob, and Jacob has Joseph. And through Joseph, they end up down in Egypt, and it was a good thing. It was something that saved the family of Jacob, and Jacob has his name changed to Israel by God. And so changed the family of Israel, and that family went down to Egypt, and after 400 years, God brought them back out of Egypt after they had been persecuted. And that's what Passover is all about. And brought them back to the land of Canaan. And under Joshua, they conquered in Canaan. They didn't conquer the whole land, but they went through, and many of the major cities they took out. And so you see some of that in archaeology. Hatzor, we were just talking about that the other day.
City of David.
Yeah, City of David, yeah. And so they came in, and they had a major presence in Canaan, and over the next 500 years or so, they drove out many of the Canaanites, and it became the land of Israel. And so that's where the temple was built. When they came out of Egypt, they built what was called the tabernacle, and it was kind of a portable temple. That tabernacle was based at Shiloh, what we would call Shiloh, in Israel, and actually they found the site for where the tabernacle was. And so Israel has a long history in the land of Canaan, pre-2000 BC. And then from the time of Moses, depending on your dating method, I think right around 1400 BC is when they came in at the time of Joshua. And so they had a little vacation, about 586 BC for 70 years, and then they were back in the land, and they were there during the time of Christ. And it was after 70 AD, a Jewish rebellion against the Romans, actually a second rebellion against the Romans. And in 70 AD, you had Jerusalem conquered. And then in 132 AD, with the Bar Kokhba revolt, the Romans got very hard-nosed, and many of the Jews were dispersed into the rest of the world. Still had a presence.
Expelled all over.
Yeah. Still had a presence up around the Galilee and in areas like that, but just a long history in the land of Israel. And that's why it's called the land of Israel.
Right.
Yeah.
And the God, as far as the God of the Bible is concerned, that's land that He gave to the Jewish people.
Yeah, there is a story in Genesis 15 when Abraham comes back from, it's called the slaughter of the kings. He goes to save his nephew Lot, who's been taken captive by a coalition of kings that came down and raided Saudi Arabia. And after that, God speaks to Abraham and says, I'm your shield and your great reward. And Abraham says, Lord, what do I have a need of a reward? I don't have a child. And that was one of the things that God had promised Abraham, that he was going to have a child. And he tried to do something in that arena with having a relationship with Hagar, one of his wife's maidservants, and that's where Ishmael came from. And but God had told him that Ishmael was not going to be the promised child, and it ended up being Isaac. Well, when Abraham said that to God, Abraham also said, God said, your progeny, your seed is going to be like the stars of the heavens in multitude. In another place he says, like the sand on the seashore. And Abraham said, how am I going to know this? And what he's asking for is a promise. He's asking for a covenant with God. And so God tells him to set up a blood covenant, and that he would appear and make a covenant with him. Well, Abraham sets the whole thing up. He gets the sacrifices together and splits sacrifices, lays them out on the ground, and God puts him to sleep. And when Abraham wakes up, he wakes up in the middle of God proclaiming the covenant, and God promising him the land of Israel, and the fact that he was going to be, his progeny was going to be a nation, and that they were going to be a blessing to the whole world. And what Abraham saw when he opened his eyes was like a burning torch going through the pieces of the sacrifices. And the way this worked was a blood sacrifice. When you were going to make a covenant with somebody, a blood covenant, what you were saying is, if I fail in this covenant, then what happened to these animals should happen to me. That's the idea behind a blood covenant. It's a death penalty if I fail in my promises. And what God did was he didn't allow Abraham to walk through the pieces. God did it by himself. And so that covenant was not based on Abraham's performance. It was based on the promise of God and nothing else. And so God has promised the nation of Israel, the land of Israel, and that they would be a nation, and that they would be a blessing to all the world. And one of the ways that blessing obviously comes out is our country is based on our form of government is based on Israeli law.
Right.
It's based on the old covenant, on the Ten Commandments. And so whenever I'm going through the Old Testament, I'm pointing out certain things that we have in our jurisprudence that came straight from the Bible.
Yeah.
And so you have that. And then you can, it's always fun to go through a list of Israelis, Jews, down through the years, and the things that they've done for society. Einstein was a Jew, and you've got all these different Jewish men and women that were just. Whenever I think about this, I think about science and medicine and that kind of thing, and just really a blessing to the world. And then on top of that, the biggest blessing that the world's ever gotten is a Jewish guy who grew up and was born in Bethlehem and grew up in Nazareth.
Yeah.
And we believe him to be the Messiah, and it's through him that we enter into the covenant of Israel. We don't become Israelis. I can't become a Christian and then go over to Israel and say, hey, land, nation, and blessing.
Yeah.
I want some land. That's not what the Bible teaches.
We're not from any of those tribes.
Yeah, we're not from the tribes of Israel, but because of what Abraham did and the fact that his seed came and not only came to the people of Israel, but he said, other sheep I have. And so we come into the covenant blessing of Abraham, not through the land portion of the blessing or the nation portion of the blessing. We are not Israel. It's through the blessing portion where God said all the nations of the world would be blessed. And Paul makes that clear in the book of Galatians. And so Israel being in the land is something that God has promised, and he also predicted the fact that they would be out of the land.
Right.
In the book of Deuteronomy. And so even, Moses is 120 years old. He's talking to the people who've come out of the Exodus and telling them what their history is basically going to be before the history happens in Deuteronomy 28 through 30. And he says to them, if you obey me, then I'm going to bless you, and all the nations are going to know that you're blessed by God. And if you disobey me, then I'm going to curse you. And people are going to ask, why are they so cursed? And it's because they disobeyed the commandments of the Lord their God, and that they were going to be dispersed among all the nations. And then it flat out says that even though they're dispersed among all the nations, not just Babylon or not just Assyria, but among all the nations, it flat out says in Deuteronomy that God's going to gather them back from all the nations and bring them back to the land of Israel. And again, the reason that he can do that is because of the blood covenant that he made with Abraham, not based on the performance of the Israelis. Mm-hmm. It's based on God's promise to these people. And so God fulfills his promises. Israel is going to be the nation during the kingdom age. And so you have all these passages in the Old Testament that talk about Israel being central to the kingdom of God here on earth. And obviously, we believe that God's going to fulfill his word, and he's in the process of doing that. Israel is the regathering of the nation of Israel is the major last days prophecy. There are other things that go along with that, but for the things that we see in the Bible to take place, Israel has to be back in the land, and they have to be in control of the land. And so yeah.
Which we think happened in 1948.
Well, we don't think it; they're there.
Right. That's right. Okay, so I wanted you to lay that out because it doesn't matter what people say about the right to the land as far as God's concerned, or the fact that people replace Israel, aka the church, or anything. As far as God's concerned, it's his land that he gave to the Jews, and there's this eschatological plan, even that hasn't happened yet as far as the throne of David and things, that God still considers to be happening.
Yeah, he made a promise. One of the things that's interesting about the giving of the law, so Moses goes up on to Mount Sinai, and he gets the Ten Commandments, and they have a blood covenant too. But in that blood covenant, what happens is Moses takes the blood of the sacrifice and he sprinkles it on the book of the law, and that's God's part. And then he takes the blood of the sacrifice and he sprinkles it on the people. And so they're in a full-blown blood covenant. Mm-hmm. And so if they fail, then God has no reason that he has to honor his promises in his covenant with Moses, and that's called the Mosaic covenant. And so they break it. And so Moses goes up on the mountain. He's gone for 40 days. He's going to get the Ten Commandments, and God tells him to get back down to his people, and he and Joshua come back down, and they find just a train wreck. And worshiping a false idol. And what God says to Moses is, I am going to destroy these people, and I'm going to start over with you. And the reason that he does that is because God made a blood covenant. Moses was part of that blood covenant. Moses was the one who kept it, and all the rest of the people broke it. And so now God's going, okay, it's a contract. And so now it's time to get rid of these people. We'll start over with you. And Moses says a number of things. One of the things he says is, Lord, you can't do that. The Egyptians are going to mock you if you do. This is not going to be something that glorifies you. And I'm paraphrasing. And then the second thing that he does is he says, and what about Abraham? What about the promise that you made to Abraham? And so Moses, he knows his law. And so he knows he can't intercede for the people of Israel based on performance of the Mosaic law, but he knows that he can go before God based on God's promise to Abraham and to Abraham's seed, which is the people of Israel. And that's why you have the continuation of the nation of Israel. And so there's always been this, when you see Old Testament Israel, there's been this tension. And so there's the keeping of the law and how God blesses or curses, depending on what they do with the keeping of the law. But then there's always the grace of God in the Abrahamic covenant. These are God's people. They're always going to be God's people, and you can't take away the promises of God. And so Paul makes that clear in a number of passages.
Right.
And so you see this in Romans chapter 9, you see it in Romans chapter 11. It's clear that even in the New Testament. We kind of need to move on, but one more statement. One of the things that happened when there was the split between the Jews and the believers in Jesus as Messiah, the ones who did not believe in Jesus as Messiah and the ones who did, when that split took place, there was animosity between the church and the Jews. And in the midst of that whole thing, the Romans entered in, and there were persecutions that took place. And when the Christian church became the state religion of the Roman Empire, one of the things that happened was there was some payback that they decided to do, and it caused major problems between the Jews and the Christians for the next 1,600 years. And a lot of this stuff about the church replacing Israel came from that period of time, specifically from Augustinianism. And so it's not what the New Testament teaches. It's something that was taught later on, and it's just not biblical.
Okay.